All right, then. It's time for another installment of the Don't So. Today, we're going to be talking about the Don's Playbook. This is how to run a criminal organization from an expert. So, let's get into it. Here's what you'll learn in this video. What are the three main parts of the playbook? What does the playbook actually cover? Who are the main players? And finally, what's the best way to get your hands on a copy of the playbook? Let's do this. Okay, so if you've been following the channel for a while, then you probably know that we've talked about the Don quite a bit before. You might even have heard me describe him as my favorite mobster. If not, well, there you go. In fact, I've had spent so much time with his story that I've had broken down his rise and fall into two separate videos. But today, we're not going to talk about Michael Corleone. We're going to talk about his dad, Don Vito Corleone. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the inner workings of his criminal empire. Now, if you're familiar with The Godfather Part 2, then you may remember a scene where young Vito Corleone returns to Italy after killing a man in... While he's there, he meets up with some old friends from Little Italy who basically say, "Yo, Vito, we've heard about you. You've got a rep over here, but now you gotta earn your stripes." So they send him on a series of missions that test his loyalty, power, cunning. Etc. By the end of these tests, Vito has proven himself worthy of being made an official member of the family. And when he comes back to America, he's given the official title of Don Vito Corleone. Anyway, during this same scene, one of the other members of the family is heard saying, "Don't get confused. It's all in the book." So what exactly is the book? Well, as it turns out, the book is basically just a handbook for the Corleone crime family. It outlines their business interests, their structure, their goals, their strategies, everything really. And because it's such a fascinating piece of fictional storytelling, I'm going to spend the rest of this video breaking it down. All right, so now that we understand what the playbook is, let's talk about what it covers. First, the playbook lays out the basic structure of the family business. Now, if you've seen any of the Godfather movies, or if you've done any research on the Mafia in general, then you already know that the family is the core unit of any crime syndicate. That's because blood ties, which are strengthened by tradition and solidified by ritual, are considered to be the strongest bonds in the Mafia world. Of course, there were also associates and other allies of the family, but those people would never be trusted as much as actual blood relatives. Also, since the family was the smallest possible unit within the organization, it was also the most easily managed. The boss could keep tabs on his immediate family members, make sure that they were doing their jobs. You know, kind of like a manager at work. When it came to the extended family, though, things got a little bit more complicated. This included people like cousins and in-laws and other close friends of the family. These people were still trusted more than outsiders, but they had to prove themselves over long periods of time before the Don would trust them to handle important matters. Finally, there were the outsiders. Everyone outside of the family was viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves to be trustworthy. Now, in practice, this meant that most business associates, lawyers, accountants, frontmen, etc. started off as outsiders. After years of working together, some of them would eventually be accepted into the family, but that was a big deal, and it didn't happen very often. Now, it wasn't just the structure of the organization that was outlined in the playbook. It also explained the goals and values of the Corleone family. Now, despite the fact that they were criminals, the Corleones weren't just some mindless thugs looking to kill people and take their stuff. They were ambitious, intelligent individuals who wanted to build a legitimate business. As Tom Hagen famously said, "A mafia family is like a regular family. You gotta look out for each other." And that's why the Corleone family took pride in the fact that they did business with honor. They believed in personal loyalty and family first, and they were willing to do whatever it took to protect both. Also, even though they operated outside of the law, they weren't above seeking legal counsel. In fact, They had a team of lawyers on retainer whose job it was to make sure that their activities couldn't be traced back to them. And that's how the Corleone family was able to grow their criminal empire without ever getting caught. Next, the playbook covered strategy and operations. How exactly did the Corleones become the most powerful family in New York? Well, according to legend, they did it the same way that Vito Corleone tested young Vito, by performing small tasks for the other families until they were given bigger and bigger responsibilities. Eventually, they were trusted enough to run entire departments, and then eventually, they were trusted enough to run the whole thing. By the time Vito became the Don, he was the most respected and feared member of the commission, which meant that he basically ran all of organized crime in the United States. Under him, the 5 families operated with efficiency and precision, making millions of dollars every year through gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and later, unions and the drug trade. Also, even though the 5 families were technically independent of one another, they worked together to achieve common goals. For example, when war broke out in Europe, they agreed to pool their resources so that they could make money off of the conflict. They also agreed to respect one another as territory and to avoid competing with one another in certain areas. This kept the peace for the most part, and it allowed them to operate more efficiently. Finally, the playbook explained the punishments that were handed out for breaking the rules. Now, if you've watched any of the Godfather movies, then you know that there was no greater insult than being banished from the family. That's because the Mafia believed that blood ties were the strongest bonds possible, and therefore it was a grave offense to betray one's family. The punishment for such a crime was exile. The Don would literally cut the traitor out of the family, severing all ties with them. Now, in most cases, this meant that the traitor would be killed, but sometimes the Don would order that they simply be left alone in some other city, never to return home again. That was the ultimate fate of Michael Corleone's brother, Fredo. After he betrayed him in a last-ditch attempt to regain power, he was sent away to an island, never to be heard from again. So those were the main sections of the playbook. Now, let's talk about who the main characters are. As far as I can tell, there were 4 main players in the Corleone playbook. The first was the Don. Even though he was officially the head of the family, the Don was more than just a leader. He was the living embodiment of the family itself. As Tom Hagen once put it, you don't go after the Don, you go after the family. And that's why the Don was always surrounded by bodyguards and always careful about where he went and what he did. After all, if anything happened to him, then the entire family would collapse into chaos. That's why it was so important for the Don to be strong, smart, and ruthless. He had to be able to make tough decisions quickly and efficiently. He also had to be respected and feared by everyone in the family. The next player was the consigliere, who was essentially the Don's right-hand man. He was usually an older member of the family who was trusted by the Don more than anyone else. The consigliere's job was to advise the Don on important matters and to carry out his orders. In The Godfather, the consigliere is played by Tom Hagen, who is the smartest character in the movie. He was a lawyer by trade, which made him uniquely qualified to handle the family's affairs. In addition to being smart, Hagen was also loyal and trustworthy. That's why he was the only person that the Don trusted to handle his personal affairs. Then there was the Capo Regime, who was the leader of the soldiers. The Capo was responsible for carrying out the Donni's orders and keeping the family's business running smoothly. In most cases, the Capo was a younger, more hot-headed member of the family. They were the ones who were always eager to take out the trash, so to speak. But despite their hot tempers, the Capos were also very capable. They were the ones who kept the family's enemies at bay and made sure that their businesses were profitable. Finally, there were the soldiers. These were the foot soldiers of the organization. They were the ones who did the dirty work, so to speak. The soldiers were usually young and impressionable, and they looked up to the Capo regime as role models. That's why it was so important for the Capo to be strong and decisive. The soldiers also reported to the... Okay, So those were the main players in the playbook. Now let's talk about what you need to do in order to get your hands on a copy. Unfortunately, if you want to read the Godfather playbook, then you're pretty much out of luck. That's because it's a completely fictional story. There is no real playbook that you can buy or steal or download. However, there are some books on mafia culture that cover similar topics. So if you want to learn more about how the mafia works, then you should check those out. As always, stay tuned for more content. Until then, you can watch these videos right here.